one thing from your past that I find pretty fascinating, and we might be able to get a bit of great conversation here, a bit of deep conversation here, is around econometrics. So it's not something that I know a ton about, which is partly why I want to ask about it. But I know that it's really fascinating. So to mitigate climate change, aligning incentives and desired consumer behaviors to reduce carbon footprints is one of the big roadblocks. I mean, for example, getting people if off of fossil fuels and onto electric vehicles would make a difference, or convincing people to fly less, for example, would make a difference. Um, Actually, and just the kinds of things that you mentioned, like being thoughtful about having a timer set so that you're using high drain devices at low demand times of day. So yeah, these kinds of behavioral changes, behavioral economics, econometrics are powerful tools to study these kinds of effects. You've published research in the past on these topics, like social proof and norming, and the ability of these concepts to influence people's environmental behaviors. And I guess that also, when you say, you said at least once in this episode, coming back to the environment. So I guess this is what you're saying. So you've done this kind of research in the past, and after Uber, Rent the Runway, Columbia University, now you're back doing this kind of climate stuff. So that was a very long question. I had all kinds of different things in there, but one, just confirming that this is what you mean by coming back to climate, and then letting us know what like social proof and norming mean as terms, um, and how this impacts what you're doing today.
Yes. So I started my career actually doing environmental consulting and very quickly realized I'd rather build things than tell people what to build. So it's cool working with DOE and EPA data, Department of Energy and Environmental Protection Agency data. But I moved into tech by taking a job at OPower. And OPower's fundamental learning that led the founders of OPower to create the company was about how behavioral science could be used to drive people to save energy in their homes. And the study was done in the mid 2000s, where researchers put one of 5 door hangers on the doorknobs of a couple hundred households in Southern California. And they partnered with the local utility to take the consumption data from all of those homes and measure pre and post the intervention. And the 5 door hangers had different messages. They all asked the consumer to save energy, but one of them was, do this for the environment. One of them said, do this for your community. One of them was for financial reasons. One was season dependent. It's summer. Be more efficient. And the last one said, your neighbors are doing it. Why can't you? And that 5th one had the highest impact on people's energy savings rates. And so the OPower concept was really running with that and saying, if we can design large-scale experiments where we send monthly or at least semi-regular emails and physical pieces of mail to people's homes with insights about their energy usage and, critically, a comparison to their neighbors, can we get them to save energy? And the reason we had to run it as a large-scale experiment was to be able to convince regulators that those energy savings were real and that the utilities that we worked with could claim those savings as part of state regulatory programs. That was what made it a business and not just a nonprofit or an annoying mailer. So as part of running this business, we were gathering data from every utility we worked with. And in addition to using that data to measure the impact of our interventions, it was what we used to define what your similar homes neighbors group was. So that was an unsupervised learning problem, right? And we were using not just how much energy you use, but also any data we have about the home. So the age of the home, size of the home, any known appliances, pools, solar panels, things that really impact the energy footprint. And that helped us derive a really meaningful set of neighbors that we could compare you to, because if you're too high or too low, it doesn't become helpful. So that was one really interesting data problem at OPower. But the other one was that for a utility to want to pay for this program, they needed some level of predictability. Like changing the demand in a service area too much without being able to plan for it is high risk. And so the forecasting component was where I spent a lot of time. And building that model, we pulled in all that same data about how we derived your similar neighbors, but we also pulled in other factors that we thought might help us understand your propensity to make changes to your behavior. And part of that was the content that we put on the reports. So it's how do you compare to your neighbors, as well as any tips we could provide or specific comms from that utility. But it was also more broadly spending being done at the state or local level, and it was demographics. And I think finally, weather, of course, is really important, just to know um, how much you could save. And as I was building those models, one of the, some of the features that were really important in predicting energy savings are pretty easy to guess, right? If you're a very high energy user, you have more space to bring it down. Similarly, if you live somewhere where you use both electric heat and you have an air conditioner, like those are discrete things that you can change your behavior on. But some of the factors that we found were a little harder to understand and probably the most interesting. So one of those was the state and local government efficiency spending. And we found that even controlling for demographics and location and other factors, this was a meaningful predictor. And so this was a finding that we took to a conference. One of my co-authors was on the policy side. And so we took these findings to the 2014 ACEEE conference, which is the American Council for Energy Efficient Economy, heavy hitter in the space in terms of like getting smart people together to talk about some of the learnings. And the hypothesis we took to this group was, so we took our findings, obviously, but paired it with this hypothesis that this type of spending was priming customers to be more receptive to interventions on energy spending or on energy efficiency. So essentially, if you have been seeing your utility investing in changes and your local government talking about those investments, you are more willing to take action when you see that you're an inefficient household than somebody who didn't have access to the resources, the education, the social norm, and support to do that. And the data bore that out. And it was a really great finding to be able to talk about with policymakers and utility leaders who really have this question, is all this education spending I'm doing meaningful? It's super hard to measure. Maybe you can measure email open rates and click-through rates, but what's actually sinking in and how is it changing behavior? And what we were able to show is that spending on education coupled with spending on these explicit energy programs, 2 + 2 = 5. So that was a really exciting finding.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that is actually, I've never thought about how 2 plus 2 = 5 is always this like 1984 Orwellian concept of a bad thing that we want to avoid and misinformation. But in that context of, the sum is greater than the whole of its parts, it actually makes a lot of sense. I'd never heard that before. Speaking of Orwellian and changing people's behaviors, so something that we talked about a lot in episode number 715 of this show, we had Professor Alan Downey on the show, and he talked us through tons of examples of everyday situations where psychological research is interesting and where it has a real world impact, like takeaway message that we can use in real life. And one of the things that I found most fascinating in an episode that is cover to cover, absolutely riveting, is that he talked about how attitudes shift over time. So there are um, there are different ways that it shifts. So, for example, it shifts by generation. So younger people are more likely to have more liberal values on things like, it would have been years ago, things like just inter-race relationships, and more recently things like gay rights and transgender people, and so these kinds of liberal ideas are much more accepted by younger generations. And so there's this like generational effect, but people also change over time. So an individual over their lifetime will shift, although typically not as quickly as a new person who's born. Like the shift over time is slower, and so there's this interesting thing that I talked about on the show, which is that obviously, like in some ways, this is really obvious what I'm going to say. It's not profound at all, but in other ways, I feel like we don't think about it enough. It's just not something that I talk about in conversation a lot, which is that anything that we think, almost we have some of our own original thoughts, where we come up with some, we tinker around with some data science model for a while and we figure out some new approach that maybe no one has ever thought of before. We could potentially publish a paper on it, or it ends up being something valuable that adds to our company's intellectual property, whatever. But most ideas that we have come from the outside. And of course, the time that you're born into is going to have a huge bearing and where you're born, when you're born, the particular family you're born into. Obviously, all of these things are going to hugely influence your perception of the world. Um, there's no absolutely correct perspective. It's constantly shifting over time. And so a lot of what you're talking about is, things like having the door hanger that says, your neighbors are doing it, why can't you? Is, the idea here is to nudge people in the direction of a behavior that is, better for society. And so you probably kind of get where I'm going here, which is like, is there like a right amount or a wrong amount of like nudging people's opinions? Like, to some extent, every conversation or every advertising campaign. And it's interesting how when it's like a consumer behavior, like buy more hamburgers, there's very little pushback of like, oh, you're trying to brainwash me, when obviously that is what's happening. When like exposure changes your mind. When you see ads for the hamburger, you're more likely to get a hamburger. Me talking about hamburgers right now is increasing the probability that our listeners are going to buy hamburgers. This message was not paid for by the hamburger lobby. Um, but I should have been talking about veggie burgers. That would have been better for the environment. Here we are on a climate change episode, and I'm talking about this methane belching animal that we do horrible things to get our burgers. I wish I could go back and change all that. But anyway, so yeah, so you get where I'm going with this. Maybe you'll have something interesting to say. I don't even have like a very specific question, but it's like something around, if we're, especially when maybe the government is funding it and this is changing behaviors. Yeah, I don't know if you just have any kind of interesting thoughts that you can contradict me on or build upon.
Well, I think you made a really important point there, which is so much of what companies are trying to do, especially consumer companies, is change consumer behavior in some way. And as a data scientist, I've worked at exclusively consumer companies. Even if they had a B2B sales motion, it was ultimately a B2B2C. So I was working directly with consumer data. Individual humans were my subjects and my research subjects. And that's really something that I've been thinking about for a long time. And it's a reality that I've chosen to operate within by picking who I work for and saying, if I'm going to change someone's behavior with my work, 'cause that's what data science is quite effective at helping do, especially now that I've realized I'm not a pure research person, as much as I love R&D problems as well. I want to work somewhere that's moving the needle in a direction that feels right to me. And so I don't think I'm answering your question by putting boundaries on how much we can move consumer behavior, but just recognizing that it is a huge part of our economic system and the companies that operate within it, and choosing to put your skills to use to change behavior in a way that resonates with your values is a good step to take. And then in terms of government spending, vote. Make sure the people choosing how to, spend that money